The funeral home smelled overwhelmingly of lilies and damp coats, a suffocating combination that made it hard to breathe. But it wasn't the scent of death that made my stomach turn. It was the sight of a woman named Linnea gently straightening my father's tie in the viewing room, while her 9-year-old son, Tobias, sat on the velvet sofa playing a game on his phone. My mother's casket was closed just 10 feet away, her body not yet in the ground, and here they were, the pristine, alternative family my father had secretly curated, while my mother spent her final 2 years fatting away in a sterile hospice bed. "Beatrix, be reasonable," my father, Kenneth, whispered when I confronted him behind the heavy privacy curtain. His voice carried that familiar, patronizing warmth he used whenever he wanted to make my sanity feel like a liability. "Linnea has been an incredible support to me during this agonizing process. Tobias wanted to pay his respects. Your mother would have wanted us to have comfort." I looked at him, truly looked at him, noticing the crispness of his new charcoal suit. A suit I had never seen before, likely picked out by the woman currently adjusting the collar. For 26 years, I had watched my mother, Maeve, bend her entire existence to fit his needs, managing his moods, his failed business ventures, and his fragile ego, only to be replaced before her obituary notice had even gone out in the local paper. The betrayal didn't feel like a sudden, sharp stab. It felt like a slow, freezing numbness creeping up from my throat. "Comfort?" I asked, my voice barely a thread, yet sharp enough to make his eyes flicker toward the curtain. "She isn't even buried yet, Dad. You brought her into this building. You brought her child." "Linnea is part of my life now, Beatrix. The timeline doesn't change the reality of my grief," he said, his face hardening into that stubborn, defensive mask he wore whenever his morality was questioned. "I've been alone for a very long time. You have your own life in the city. You weren't here for the late-night phone calls, the endless hospital corridors. I was." The rewrite of history was already beginning. He was erasing my mother's presence, painting himself as the tragic martyr of her illness, all to justify the fact that Linnea's name was already on the lease of his townhouse, a detail I had accidentally discovered on his kitchen counter the morning before. He thought I was weak because I was quiet, that my grief had hollowed me out enough to make me compliant. As the first guests began to trickle into the foyer, their wet shoes squeaking against the polished hardwood, my father smoothed his lapels and stepped out from behind the curtain, plastering on a look of dignified sorrow. I stood alone in the shadow of the velvet drapes, watching Linnea take her seat in the very front row, the row reserved for immediate family. My hands trembled inside my coat pockets, my fingers wrapping around the small, tarnished silver key to my mother's old writing desk. My father thought he had managed this transition perfectly, that he could slide one woman out and another one in without a single crack appearing in his respectable facade. He didn't know what my mother had left behind in that desk. He didn't know that I had already opened it. The front row of the chapel was a master class in silent warfare. Linnea sat perfectly straight, her hands clasped over a black leather purse, occasionally leaning over to smooth down Tobias's cowlick. She didn't look like a villain. She looked like a woman who had been told she belonged there, her eyes carefully cast down in a display of practiced reverence. My father sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a united front against the whispers rising from the back pews. I refused to sit with them. Instead, I took a place 3 rows back, tucked between my mother's elderly cousin and a neighbor who smelled of mothballs. From here, I could see the back of my father's neck. Every time someone walked up to offer condolences, he would sigh, nod heavily, and then introduce Linnea as his dear friend who has been an absolute rock. It was a trial run. He was testing the waters of our small town, gauging how much hypocrisy people were willing to swallow in the name of politeness. The service passed in a blur of organ music and words that didn't fit the woman my mother had been. The minister spoke of Maeve's quiet, submissive nature and her dedication to her husband's happiness. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. My mother hadn't been submissive. She had been exhausted. She had spent the last decade shrinking herself so Kenneth could feel large. After the casket was lowered into the damp earth under a gray, spitting sky, the guests migrated to the local parish hall for the reception. I arrived late, purposely walking slow, wanting the cold air to clear the smell of formaldehyde from my lungs. When I stepped into the hall, the The first thing I saw was Tobias running a toy car along the edge of the buffet table, right past the platters of ham sandwiches. "Beatrix, dear, there you are," Linnea said, intercepting me before I could reach the coffee urn. She held out a small plate with a slice of lemon loaf. Her voice was soft, carrying a practiced maternal warmth that made my skin prickle. "You look absolutely frozen. Kenneth told me how close you were with your mother. I just want you to know I'm not here to replace her. I just want to support your father." "You shouldn't be here," I said, keeping my voice level, my eyes locked on hers. Linnea's smile didn't entirely vanish, but it stiffened. "I know this is incredibly difficult timing, but Kenneth was so lonely, Beatrix. When Maeve was in the facility, he would sit in that big house completely lost. Sometimes people need a lifeline before they completely sink." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air between us. She was rewriting my mother's illness as a personal inconvenience to my father. Before I could respond, my father appeared, placing a heavy, possessive hand on Linnea's shoulder. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes darting between us, a warning flash in his gaze. "Of course, Ken," Linnea murmured, patting his hand. "Beatrix and I were just finding our footing." "Good," my father said, looking at me with a hard, uncompromising stare. "Because Linnea and Tobias are staying at the house tonight. It makes no sense for them to drive back to the city in this weather. I expect you to be a gracious host, Beatrix. We are all grieving in our own ways." He was forcing my hand, using the public setting to ensure I wouldn't make a scene. But as I looked at the two of them, standing together in front of my mother's mourning friends, the silver key in my pocket felt heavy against my thigh. They wanted to move into my mother's house tonight. They wanted her spaces. But they didn't know that the house still belonged to her ghosts and her secrets. The drive back to the house was completely silent. I drove my mother's faded sedan, following my father's pristine SUV through the winding, tree-lined roads of the valley. In my rearview mirror, I could see the headlights of his car illuminating the falling sleet. Inside that warmth sat Kenneth, Linnea, and Tobias, already occupying the space of a family unit, while I trailed behind like an unwanted ghost. When we pulled into the graveled driveway of the heavy timber framing house my grandfather had built, the porch light was already on. My father had left it on before the funeral. He stepped out of his car, holding a large umbrella over Linnea's head, guiding her around the puddles with a tender care he hadn't shown my mother in 15 years. Tobias ran ahead, his sneakers thumping loudly on the wooden steps. "Wipe your feet, Tobias," Linnea called out, though her voice lacked any real authority. It was the tone of a guest pretending to be a mistress. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately met by the scent of lavender furniture polish and stale potpourri, my mother's smell. It was a house frozen in the mid-2000s, filled with floral cushions, framed watercolor landscapes, and shelves of porcelain figurines my father had always complained took up too much space. "God, it's freezing in here," my father muttered, heading straight for the thermostat. "Beatrix, why don't you make a pot of tea? Linnea's had a long day." "I'm going upstairs to change," I said, ignoring the request entirely. I climbed the carpeted stairs, my limbs heavy with a bone-deep exhaustion. At the top of the landing, I stopped. The door to my parents' master bedroom was wide open. Inside, 2 large, designer leather suitcases were parked neatly at the foot of the mahogany bed. Linnea's suitcases. They hadn't even waited for the funeral to end to bring her things inside. They had loaded the car last night. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I walked past the master bedroom to the small, cramped sewing room at the end of the hall. This had been my mother's sanctuary, the only room in the house my father hadn't bothered to redecorate or claim. In the corner sat her roll-top writing desk. I locked the sewing room door behind me, the click of the lock offering a small modicum of safety. I pulled the silver key from my pocket, my hands shaking so violently I dropped it twice before finally sliding it into the brass keyhole. The wood groaned as I rolled back the slatted top. Inside, the desk was meticulously organized. Bills paid up to the month of her hospitalization, old greeting cards from me, and a stack of small, leather-bound journals. I pulled out the most recent one, its spine barely broken. I flipped past pages of medical appointments and grocery lists until I hit an entry dated 6 months ago, right around the time my father claimed he was completely lost and alone. Kenneth brought the woman to the hospital today, the elegant cursive read, the ink slightly smeared. He thought I was asleep under the sedation. He whispered to her that the house would be empty by spring. He told her the lawyer had finalized the restructuring. He is waiting for me to die so he can take the land. He doesn't know I saw the signature. A floorboard creaked outside the sewing room door. I froze, slamming the journal shut and shoving it into my waistband, just as a soft, rhythmic knocking rattled the wood. "Beatrix," Linnea's voice came through the panel, low and sweet. "Your father said you might have some extra pillows up here. I want to make sure Tobias is comfortable in the guest room." I held my breath for a count of 3, letting the leather spine of the journal press hard against my ribs. I smoothed down my heavy sweater, unlocked the door, and opened it just a crack. Linnea stood in the dim hallway, her black funeral dress replaced by a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked entirely too expensive for someone who claimed to be a humble family friend. She held a stack of folded towels in her arms, her eyes darting past my shoulder into the darkness of the sewing room. "The linen closet is at the end of the hall, Linnea," I said, my voice deadpan, blocking her view of the desk. "Top shelf. There are plenty of pillows." "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, not moving. She offered a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a beautiful house, a bit. Cluttered, but it has good bones. Kenneth mentioned your grandfather built it. It's a shame the upkeep has gotten so ahead of him lately." She was already assessing the property, calculating the value of the timber and the acreage, while my mother's scent still lingered in the curtains. She was checking the corners for things to throw away. "The house is exactly how my mother liked it," I replied, stepping out into the hallway and locking the door behind me with a deliberate, audible click. I dropped the key into my pocket. Linnea's eyes followed the movement of my hand. The sweetness in her expression faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, calculating coldness before she masked it again. "Of course, it's important to hold on to memories, but life does move forward, Beatrix. Your father needs a fresh start. This place has been a tomb for the last 2 years." "A tomb he built," I murmured, walking past her down the stairs before she could reply. Downstairs, the kitchen hummed with the sound of the refrigerator and the low murmur of the television. My father was sitting in his usual armchair in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching a financial news program as if today had been just any other Tuesday. Tobias was on the floor, sorting through a box of old board games my mother had kept for when I was a child. "Dad," I said, entering the kitchen and leaning against the counter. "What did Mum mean by the restructuring?" My father didn't look up from the television immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink, swallowed, and then turned his head toward me, his brow furrowing into a look of practiced confusion. "What are you talking about, Beatrix? Restructuring what?" "The property, the land," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, testing the waters just as he had done at the funeral. "She mentioned something about a lawyer before she got really sick." The glass in his hand moved slightly, the ice clinking against the crystal. A subtle shift occurred in his posture, the slight tensing of his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that lacked any real warmth. "Your poor mother was heavily medicated at the end, Beatrix. She was hallucinating, grasping at straws. There is no restructuring. The house is mine, as it always has been. Now, please, let's not drag paranoia into a house of mourning." He turned back to the television, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. But I knew that tone. It was the exact voice he used when I was 12 and asked why a collection agency kept calling our house. He was lying. And as I reached into my waistband to touch the hidden journal, I knew my mother hadn't been hallucinating at all. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the valley wrapped in a heavy, suffocating mist. I sat at the kitchen table, a cold mug of coffee between my hands, watching through the window as my father helped Tobias assemble a brand new bicycle on the gravel driveway. It was a bright red, aggressive-looking thing, completely out of place against the weathered gray timber of the barn. My father was laughing, clapping the boy on the back with an easy, unburdened joy I hadn't seen him display in over a decade. "Kenneth always wanted a son," Linnea's voice startled me. She had walked into the kitchen so quietly her soft slippers hadn't made a sound on the linoleum. She was wearing one of my mother's old aprons, a faded blue cotton one with a frayed pocket, tied tightly around her waist. The sight of it sent a physical jolt of anger through my chest, but I forced my fingers to remain loose around my mug. "That apron belongs to my mother," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Linnea paused, looking down at the fabric as if she had just noticed it. She gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle and began untying the strings. "Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry, Beatrix. It was just hanging on the back of the pantry door, and I didn't want to get flour on my sweater while I made pancakes for the boys." I didn't think. "You don't think about a lot of things," I said, looking her dead in the eye. Her expression shifted instantly, the faux apologetic softness hardening into the sharp, defensive mask of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She neatly folded the apron and laid it on the counter between us, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palms. "I am trying very hard to be patient with you, Beatrix," she said, her voice dropping to a low, hissed whisper so it wouldn't carry through the window. "But you are making this entirely more difficult than it needs to be. Your father has lived in a prison of caregiving for 24 months. He deserves a life. Tobias deserves a father who isn't hollowed out by grief." "And what do you deserve, Linnea?" I asked, leaning forward. "My grandfather's land, the timber rights. Is that what Kenneth promised you while my mother was choking on her own lungs in the hospice?" Linnea didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly serene smile crept across her face. "Your father is an adult, Beatrix. He can do whatever he likes with his property. And if he chooses to secure a future for the people who actually stay by his side, that is his prerogative." She turned away to pour herself a cup of coffee, her movements deliberate and victorious. She had just admitted it. She didn't care about the subtlety anymore because she believed the game was already won. I stood up, leaving my cold coffee on the table, and walked out the back door without saying another word. The cold air hit my face, shocking my system. I walked past my father and Tobias, ignoring Kenneth's greeting, and headed straight down the muddy path toward the old barn. My mother's journal was heavy against my ribs. I needed to see exactly what they had done, and I knew there was one place my father would keep the physical paperwork before transferring it to his city office: the old metal filing cabinet in the barn workshop. The barn workshop smelled of rusted iron, gasoline, and rotting damp wood. It was freezing inside, the air holding a stillness that made my breath bloom in thick white clouds. In the corner, half hidden beneath a dusty tarp and stacks of old tires, sat the heavy gray filing cabinet. My father had kept his business records here for decades, always claiming the barn was the only place he could think without my mother's clutter. I yanked the tarp away, kicking a rusted paint can out of the way. The padlock on the top drawer was old, but it was solid. I didn't have the key for this one. I looked around the messy workbench until my fingers wrapped around a heavy, flat-headed crowbar. My heart hammered against my ribs, each thud echoing in the hollow silence of the barn. I jammed the metal tip into the seam of the top drawer and pulled with everything I had. The metal groaned, a sharp, screeching protest that made me freeze, glancing back toward the barn doors. No one came. I threw my weight into it again. With a loud, violent crack, the locking mechanism snapped, and the drawer rolled open with a heavy rattle. Inside, old folders were packed tight, smelling of mildew. I flipped through them, my fingers moving frantically over labels. Taxes 2018, equipment leases, insurance. Near the back, a brand-new, pristine manila folder stood out against the yellowed paper. The tab read, ME Estate/Land Title Transfer. I pulled it out, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Inside were official legal documents dated 4 months ago, bearing the seal of a notary from the city. I scanned the dense, legal prose, the words blurring before my eyes until they focused on the core betrayal. It wasn't just a restructuring. My grandfather's will had stipulated that the house and the surrounding 40 acres of timberland were to be split equally between my mother and me upon his death, but my father had managed to bypass it. He had utilized a power of attorney my mother had signed over during her first weeks in hospice, when the heavy narcotics had left her confused and compliant. He had signed her half over to himself, completely dissolving my inheritance, and had already initiated a secondary transfer. The secondary deed listed the new owners of the property, Kenneth Vance and Linnea Home, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Looking for something, Beatrix. The voice cut through the dark barn like a whip. I spun around, clutching the folder to my chest. My father stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the bright, misty gray afternoon. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, his face set in that cold, authoritative expression he used whenever I stepped out of line as a child. He closed the heavy wooden barn door behind him, cutting off the light, plunging the workshop into a shadow that felt suffocatingly small. The darkness in the barn felt thick, tasting of old oil and cold iron. My father walked toward me, his heavy boots crunching deliberately on the gravel-strewn concrete floor. He didn't rush. He had the calm, terrifying confidence of a man who believed he held every single card. "You always had a habit of snooping where you didn't belong, Beatrix," he said, stopping just a few feet away. He looked down at the crowbar still resting against the broken metal of the filing cabinet, then up at the folder clutched against my sweater. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Criminal damage, in my own home. "Your home," I managed to say, my voice trembling with an anger so volatile I thought it might tear through my skin. "This was grandfather's house. It was Mum's house. You had her sign a power of attorney while she couldn't even remember what year it was, Dad. You stole my birthright while she was dying." Kenneth sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked genuinely fatigued, as if my grief and my anger were simply chores he was being forced to manage. "Your mother was failing, Beatrix. Her mind was gone. If I hadn't taken control of the estate, the medical bills and the care facility would have eaten this entire property alive. I protected what was left." "You protected it for her," I spat, pointing toward the house where Linnea was likely still cleaning our kitchen. "You put Linnea's name on the deed before the ink on Mum's death certificate was even dry. Don't lie to me and call it protection." "Linnea brought liquid capital into my life when I was drowning," my father said, his voice dropping into a hard, defensive register. "She helped pay for the private nursing staff your mother required at the end. She bought into this property legally, Beatrix. It's business. Something you, with your little apartment and your freelance life in the city, don't understand." He held out his hand, palm up. "Give me the folder. It changes nothing. The paperwork is filed. The land is transferred. Tomorrow morning, the surveyors are coming to mark the northern boundary for the timber sale. It's over." I looked at his open hand. For years, that hand had represented absolute authority in our family. My mother had spent decades bowing to it, apologizing for things she hadn't done just to keep the peace. I looked past him, through the small dirt-streaked window of the barn, and saw Tobias riding his bright red bicycle across the lawn, laughing. They thought they had erased her entirely. "No," I said quietly, stepping back into the shadows of the workshop. My father's hand dropped. His face darkened, the faux paternal patience completely evaporating. "Excuse me." "I'm not giving you anything," I said, my thumb feeling the edge of the papers inside the folder. "And the surveyors can come tomorrow, but they won't be cutting down a single tree." My father didn't lung for the folder. He didn't scream. That would have been too unrefined for a man who prided himself on his icy, calculated control. Instead, he simply took a step closer, his eyes narrowing into cold slits as he used his height to crowd me back against the ruined filing cabinet. "You are a guest in this house now, Beatrix," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous rattle. "The law doesn't care about your sentimentality. The law cares about signatures. Your mother signed the papers. I signed the transfer. If you make a scene tomorrow when the logging crew arrives, I will have the sheriff remove you from this property for trespassing. Do you understand me?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The sheer, transactional cruelty of his voice threatened to choke me. I squeezed the folder tighter against my chest, pushed past his shoulder, and walked out of the barn. He didn't follow me. He knew he didn't have to. He believed the legal trap he had built was completely airtight. When I re-entered the house, The atmosphere had shifted. The smell of frying bacon and maple syrup filled the air, a sickeningly domestic aroma that felt like an insult to the black wreath still hanging on the front door. Linnea was at the stove, humming a soft tune, while Tobias sat at the kitchen island happily kicking his legs against the stools. "Oh, Beatrix, there you are," Linnea said cheerfully, turning around with a spatula in her hand. "I left a plate of breakfast in the oven for you. We need to eat quickly. Your father says we have a busy afternoon of organizing the master bedroom ahead of us." She was already moving her clothes into my mother's closet. She was already planning where to put her shoes. "I'm not hungry," I said, my voice flat. I walked past the kitchen, ignoring her tight, disappointed sigh, and went straight up the stairs to my mother's sewing room. I locked the door, pulled the folder out, and laid it flat on the desk alongside my mother's journal. I opened the manila folder to the very last page, the page bearing my mother's signature on the power of attorney. I stared at the elegant cursive, comparing it to the entries in the journal. Mae Vance. The signature on the legal document was shaky, the lines uneven as if her hand had been guided by someone else's weight. But as I looked closer, tracing the loops of the letters with my index finger, I noticed a tiny, deliberate detail. My mother had been a meticulous draftsman in her youth. She knew how to read blueprints and legal descriptions. In the bottom loop of the M in Maeve, there was a microscopic, jagged double cross, a specific mark she had told me about when I was a teenager, a hidden symbol she used on financial documents whenever she felt she was being coerced or forced into a bad deal. It was her silent SOS. And right beneath the notary's stamp, dated 4 months ago, was the name of the legal witness, Linnea Home. Cold, clear wave of certainty washed over the grief in my chest. Linnea hadn't just bought into the property. She had acted as the legal witness to a power of attorney that benefited her directly. I am no lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize a fatal, greedy mistake. They had been so eager to strip my mother of her dignity that they had completely blinded themselves to the law. The realization brought a strange, icy calm over me. I sat in the dim sewing room for nearly an hour, comparing the dates. Linnea had witnessed the power of attorney on October 14th. The land transfer to her own name had been initiated less than 3 weeks later, in their frantic hurry to secure the acreage before my mother passed. Their arrogance had left a glaring, illegal trail. A beneficiary cannot act as an independent witness to the execution of the instrument that gives them their power. They had broken the law in their haste to steal from a dying woman. I took out my phone and carefully photographed every single page of the document, ensuring the notary seal and Linnea's shaky, elegant signature were perfectly clear. I emailed the files directly to my mother's old estate attorney, Mr. Gidley, a man who had known my grandfather and genuinely respected my mother. "Please look at the witness signature on page 4, I wrote in the brief message. "I need to know if this invalidates the entire transfer." When I finally unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway, the house was filled with the sound of packing tape scraping against cardboard. I walked toward the master bedroom. My father and Linnea were inside, standing before my mother's expansive wardrobe. Linnea was methodically pulling my mother's floral blouses and Sunday dresses off their velvet hangers, dropping them into a heavy black trash bag on the floor. "We can donate most of this to the church bazaar," Linnea was saying, her tone entirely clinical, as if she were clearing out an abandoned hotel room. "The heavy wool coats might be worth selling online, though." My father was at the dresser, sweeping my mother's vintage perfume bottles, the ones I used to play with as a child, into a cardboard box. The crystal bottles clinked together, a cheap, hollow sound. "Dad," I said, leaning against the doorframe. They both jumped slightly, turning to face me. My father immediately looked defensive, his jaw tightening as he braced for another emotional outburst. "Beatrix, I told you, this needs to be done. We are moving forward." "I know," I said, a faint, humorless smile touching my lips. "I just wanted to let you know that I spoke to Mr. Gidley. I sent him copies of the paperwork from the barn." Linnea paused, a half-folded cardigan freezing in her hands. Her eyes darted to my father, a sudden, sharp flicker of unease passing through her gaze. My father stepped forward, his voice dropping into that dangerous, low register. I warned you about interfering, Beatrix. If you think a local, small-town lawyer can reverse a signed power of attorney, you are entirely delusional. The documentation is legal. It would be, I replied, my voice steady, echoing clearly in the half-emptied room. If the woman who stands to inherit half the timberland hadn't signed her own name as the legal witness to the document that granted you the power to give it to her. That's self-dealing, Dad. It's a conflict of interest so severe it completely invalidates the execution. The color drained from Linnea face so fast it made her expensive cream sweater look dingy. She dropped the cardigan onto the bed, her fingers twitching toward her purse. My father froze, his hand still gripping a crystal bottle of lavender water, his eyes widening as the weight of their oversight began to crush his immaculate facade. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to make the floorboards feel like ice beneath our feet. For a long, agonizing 10 seconds, neither of them moved. My father stood paralyzed by the dresser, his fingers still locked around my mother's perfume bottle, his mind frantically running through the legal math and realizing, piece by piece, that I was right. You don't know what you're talking about, Kenneth finally said, but the authoritative weight was completely gone from his voice. It sounded hollow, paper-thin, the desperate deflection of a man who had just felt the ground give way beneath his boots. Mr. Gidley just called me back, I said, holding up my phone so the screen illuminated the dim room. The timber sale is frozen, Dad. He's filing an injunction with the county clerk first thing in the morning. He told me to tell you that if a single chainsaw touches a tree on this property, he'll have the logging company sued for conversion and you arrested for fraud. Linnea let out a sharp, ragged breath, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at my father, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and sudden, ugly resentment. Kenneth, you said your lawyer checked everything. You said the girl wouldn't be a problem. Shut up, Linnea, my father hissed, his face turning a deep, mottled purple as his composure completely shattered. He glared at me, his chest heaving under his expensive charcoal suit. You think you've won something here, Beatrix? You've just ruined this family. You've ruined our future. No, I said, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a calm, quiet whisper that cut through his rage. I protected Mum's past, and I protected my grandfather's land from the people who tried to pick her bones before she was even buried. I looked down at the black trash bag filled with my mother's clothes, then back up at the two of them. You have until sunset to get her things out of this bedroom. You can sleep in the guest room tonight, and tomorrow you can take your suitcases and your son and find somewhere else to build your new life, because this house stays exactly the way she left it. My father opened his mouth to speak, to assert some final, desperate shred of control, but no words came out. The illusion of his absolute power had vanished, leaving behind only a bitter, aging man who had compromised his soul for a deal that had just fallen apart in his hands. He turned away from me, dropping the perfume bottle back onto the dresser with a dull, defeated thud. An hour later, I stood on the back porch, wrapped in my mother's old wool shawl. The evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp pine and wet earth from the northern woods. Below me, in the driveway, Linnea was silently packing her designer suitcases back into the trunk of my father's SUV, her movements frantic and humiliated, while Tobias watched quietly from the backseat. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the small, tarnished silver key to the writing desk. The grief was still there, a heavy, aching void in the center of my chest that would take years to heal. But as I watched the shadows stretch across the untouched timberland, the suffocating weight was gone. The house belonged to the ghosts again, and for the first time since the funeral bells had rung, I could finally breathe.